Many people who experience Orthodox worship are often taken aback and feel as though it's very foreign and different from what they're used to. This discomfort can sometimes prevent them from looking further into Orthodoxy. So, I want to discuss this because I believe there are some extremely important presuppositions that need to be addressed here. Believe it or not, I think the scope of this is actually too large to address in one conversation, so I've got two other reflections that will address this from different angles. One on the topic of asceticism, and another on the topic of the pervasive and implicit nature of the prosperity gospel in American culture. So, for now, let's start with the presupposition that we must like the worship. It must fit our tastes and preferences before we are willing to attend. Well, forgive me for being blunt here, but is this not an extremely irreverent way to approach God? How dare any of us think that worship must first and foremost appeal to us and then to God? Just who are we worshiping here? God or ourselves? Unfortunately, American culture has commodified everything, and that includes religious experience. This is why New Age and the spiritual but not religious is so appealing to many in this modern era. They can simply pick and choose from the religious buffet and concoct their own unique, individualized spirituality. After all, isn't that what American culture encourages? Individuality at all costs? This is also an issue within evangelical church hopping culture. People will hop from church to church until they find a pastor they like, a church that has music that they like, and it's all about them, not God. So, just so we're being fair here, this isn't only an issue for evangelicals. All Christians can fall into this trap, including Orthodox. The criteria may be different, but the impulse to satisfy selfish desires rather than to submit to God is a fundamentally human problem. So let's take a step back here. My intent is not to be malicious towards people who think this way. It is merely to draw attention to the fact that they are thinking this way, even if it's a subconscious thing. I know many evangelicals personally. These people love God. Many are fervent in their faith. So my aim here is to redirect that love of God into humility. If we love God, if we love Christ, should we not then humble ourselves and worship in a manner that is acceptable to Him? The Orthodox Church has been around much longer than most of the American branches of Christianity that exist today. The reason Orthodox worship seems so foreign to many is actually indicative of how far their tradition has separated from the original Church of Christ. Be honest, if the apostles were alive today, would they really attend a non-denominational church? Would they put their hands up and be swaying back and forth and singing Jesus love songs? Or would they actually be doing something more akin to what the Orthodox are doing in the divine liturgy? I think if we're being truthful here, we all know the answer to that question. The reality is, how we worship God actually matters. It's not something to play around with. In the book of Exodus, Moses is taught how to worship God. This is outlined more specifically in the book of Leviticus, which is a slog to read for many, but important nonetheless. Also in Leviticus chapter 10, we see what happens when Nadab and Abihu worship God improperly whilst drunk in the middle of the night. God punishes their foolishness by smiting them dead on the spot. This sets the precedent for how important it is to worship God in a manner that is acceptable. It is not something to play around with. Fast forward to the early church, the first Christians worshipped in the temple and the synagogue until they were kicked out. They took many of the same elements that existed in Second Temple Jewish worship and Christianized them. For example, both Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Jews use incense in worship. We both read psalms in our services. Orthodox Christian chanting is very similar to what one would hear in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue today. Rather than bringing out the Torah, we process with the gospel book. Rather than sacrificing an animal, Christ is the eternal sacrifice in the Eucharist, a sacrifice of praise, as we say in the liturgy. The book of Hebrews makes no sense without the context of Jewish worship informing Christian worship. This is why Orthodox Christians worship in the way that we do, because to worship in any other way would be a disrespect to God, another strange fire like in Leviticus. This pattern of worship revealed to Moses, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and John cannot be done away with without doing irreparable damage to our faith. If we look outside the Orthodox Church, we must ask the question, when did this worship begin to change? While Rome made minor adjustments to their liturgy after the schism, Roman Catholicism didn't radically change its worship until Vatican II in the 1960s. And that was largely in response to the forms of worship occurring, you guessed it, in Protestantism. But again, we have to look at this historically to understand how we got here. The Protestant reformers didn't agree on how to reform worship. While initially fairly conservative in their changes, later generations felt at liberty to change more and more and more, to the point that nowadays, low church evangelicals feel completely out of place in a high church liturgical setting. This should be a scandal to Protestants. Your forefathers felt at liberty to change your faith, and radically at that. I don't know about you, but I don't want to attend a church that will change something as fundamental as how we worship God within a single generation, as we are presently seeing. So, this is why Orthodox worship is so foreign. It's because it's ancient. And ancient may be foreign, but if we truly love God, can that really be said to be an impediment? Are we really going to tell God on Judgment Day, yeah, I could have become Orthodox, but I didn't like how they did this and this and this? Are you really going to say that? Do not let your pride blind you. Let your love of God be the cause of your humility. There is much to be learned, and much more that can be said. I hope this reflection has explained why Orthodoxy approaches worship so differently and seems so foreign. If anyone listening is interested in this topic, I highly recommend the book Orthodox Worship by Benjamin Williams and Harold Anstall. Beyond that, I would recommend attending an Orthodox liturgy and directing any further questions to the priest.